to our positive behavioral interventions and supports, where we'll be focusing on building systems and using data to support Tier 2 practices. Because this is a lot of content, we're going to be breaking it up in 2 parts, and feel free to at any point pause the recording to see if there is anything that you would like to jot down or process. We encourage you to take notes as we go through the 2 parts of the PowerPoint. So I have my 2 colleagues with me who will be presenting today. My name is Jessica Dulé, and I am the School Climate Specialist under the Division of Teaching and Learning at OSSE. And I have been doing a lot of PBIS trainings, as well as overlooking the Restorative Justice Initiative, and also just other side work on SEL and other related behavior supports trainings. And I'll pass it over to Christian to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Christian Linderman, and I am also a school climate specialist over at OSSE. My email is there on the screen along with my colleagues, so if you're ever interested in further support around these topics, please let us know. Like Jessica, I do support around PBIS, around mindfulness and social emotional learning, and around classroom engagement. So I'm excited to have you all here with us, and I'm going to pass it over to Nakanya to introduce herself.
Thank you, Christian. Hello. My name is Nakanya Magby, also a school climate specialist. My work would entail our support around trauma-informed practices, as well as work around equity. And we are so excited to have you. So we are excited to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Jessica.
Thank you. So before we get started with the content, we do want to acknowledge and show our appreciation for the work that we have done and partnered with the OSSE Center on PBIS. Because we know that we're part of a larger network, we want to make sure that what we do in DC is aligned to what researchers are saying nationwide. So you'll see that there are different national partners here that also have a wealth of resources if you visit any one of their websites. Okay. And then to access the materials for the presentations today, you can click on, or not click on, but type in that website, or scan that QR code, and you will see that there is a folder with a PDF version of the PowerPoint, along with any other materials that we'll be referring to today. So part 1, we're going to be just providing an overview so that we are coming with a shared understanding of what MTSS and PBIS is, but with a focus on Tier 2. And then we're going to explore an action plan to support implementation of a check-in, check-out system within Tier 2. And then that will consist of a Tier 2 team, screening and decision rules, and the implementation process. In the next part, in part 2, we'll again review how we match interventions with student needs, plan for professional development and family support, and then also look at what data monitoring looks like. So of course, we in the PBIS fashion, we like to model our expectations of having our expectations on the side of being responsible, respectful, and safe. And of course, even though we're not live together, but this is something that we model that you can also take back and use in your trainings with your teams or school staff. But we want to make sure, again, that we're paying attention to what the content is, but also having an open mind and practice perspective taking as you were discussing some of the content with your colleagues. And we know that it's also important to create a safe space for dialogue where we consider the 3 gates of speech. And something that you may want to ask yourself is it kind, true for you, and necessary before we start to share our perspectives. So something that you can use back with training with your staff or team. So I'm going to start us off with an overview of what MTSS is, again with the focus on what Tier 2 looks like. Okay, next slide. So I want you to think of a visual of what upstream and downstream looks like. If we can go back one slide. When we think about MTSS, we really try to think about upstream solutions versus downstream solutions, meaning we don't wait and react for something to happen, right? Because if we do that, we start to burn out and we start to get tired and we have limited capacity based on all of our current needs. And so rather than waiting for things to come down the pipeline, we want to make sure, what can we do upstream if we know what we're anticipating downstream? What are some systems we can put in place so that we're not always on the back end reacting to everything? And so we use MTSS, which is based out of a public health model, about how do we focus our efforts into making sure that we stay on the preventative side. So with that, MTSS and PBIS is a data-driven decision-making framework for establishing the social culture and behavioral supports needed for a school to be an effective learning environment. And that, again, is applicable for academics and social-emotional behavior. And we know that this is for all students. We need to make sure that it's also a contextual fit that reflects the values and the cultural norms of the community that we're serving. So many of you have probably seen the triangle, the infamous triangle. And again, this three-tiered approach can be applied for behavior, academics, or social emotional learning. And that 3 tiers is really focusing on first that tier 1 of being preventative. What do we do for all students? And again, this is not breaking down those students versus our students, or special education over here, ELL students over there. What are we doing for all students? And that's what we call the universal or tier 1 level. And again, we want to make sure our practices are equitable. So we may use tier 1 as a way to address needs for all students, but making sure that we're reaching every student based on their needs. Some students are going to need more. And so that is where, in addition to tier 1, they may need additional support or interventions. And that is what we're doing for some students. So if tier 1 is in place, we know that we're going to at least reach about 80% of our population. And if not, we know we need to adjust what we're doing at tier 1 to make sure that we're hitting that 80% mark. That tier 2 is layered on, and that is going to be for targeted or small groups. And then if that is not enough, we know that we may need to layer on an additional tier 3 support that is more intensive and individualized. And again, if tier 1 and tier 2 are strong, then we should be reaching about 10 to 15%, about 3 to 5% at that tier 3 level. So again, we want to revisit each level to make sure that we're not, again, at that downstream level. We want to make sure that we're hitting that upstream solutions at that tier 1. And then just, a reminder that these tiers are meant to label interventions and not students. So one particular student may be doing well with problem solving, as you can see here, or math, and they're really good at anger management with any of those SEL skills. But they may need a little bit more support in how to ask for assistance, maybe some science work that they're having trouble with. And, maybe for tier 3, they may need more intensive supports in language arts, or maybe they have an attendance issue for a temporary period of time. So it's fluid, and that some of these supports are going to be short term or some may be longer than others, but we know that it's fluid. So even as adults, we have our own profile, right? There are things that we are really good at, and then there's other things where we may need that additional or intensive support. Okay, so thinking about how it applies to students, think about how your professional profile might look like, and where do you need Tier 2 supports? All right, so again, that continuum is there, and that we're constantly looking at making sure that every student has access to all 3 tiers when they need it. This other visual, in addition to the infamous triangle, are these circles. And this PBIS is actually grounded in implementation logic. So here in the outer circle, we have our outcomes. So we start there because we ask ourselves, what is it that we want to see in our school? And how are we going to measure that? So for school climate, what do we want, or what do we envision that might be looking like? Our data is going to tell us where our current reality is. So in terms of where we want to go, what is our data currently telling us what our current reality is? And then we think about what are the evidence-based practices that we want to implement to reach those outcomes. So those practices are what we do to support students. Again, making sure that it's culturally relevant and that it's matching the needs of the students in the community that we're serving. And then finally, systems are what is needed to support the practices. And that is what we're doing for the adult and staff members in the whole school. So we want to make sure that we have systems in place to help guide our practices to make sure that we're more cohesive in what we're doing. So that can include our teaming structures, our communication. How are we going to communicate between different teams in the school? How are we going to communicate what these practices are to our students? And maybe also what our communication is going to be with our families. So all of that needs to constantly work together in order to improve our outcomes. And again, it's an iterative process where we're looking at data to constantly figure out how we continuously improve. Okay, next slide. So thinking about Tier 2 implementation, and I encourage you, if you have not learned much about Tier 1, to please go into our other module to really look at and review what your Tier 1 systems are first. If that's in place, then we can start really looking at how do we get our Tier 2 systems up and running. Some key things here that we want to consider is that we want to make sure that whatever we have in place at Tier 2 is continuously available, that students can be provided support at any time, and that there's a rapid response, meaning they can have access to a simple Tier 2 intervention based on whatever their needs are. At that early Tier 2, we want to make sure that there's something that is going to require minimal teacher time. So ideally, interventions that fit within existing classroom practices. Also, it's required that teacher skills can be easily learned. So we want to make sure that it's not going to be so tedious. It should be seamless and something that is very fluid in what they're already doing. We want to make sure Tier 2 is, again, anchored or aligned with the school-wide expectations. Again, going back to making sure your Tier 1 is in place, if you don't have school-wide expectations, Tier 2 is not going to be as effective. So we want to make sure that we're linking and layering that Tier 2 on top of what we're already doing. And then thinking about what is the staff awareness of Tier 2 interventions and what is their role. So once we have that intervention in place, we need to make sure that we're communicating that to the staff members. At this early Tier 2 intervention level, we want to make sure that we're making it systematic so that early Tier 2 intervention is going to be the same for all and not individualized. And we're going to get to that, and that might be something new that you haven't heard of, but we'll be getting into that and how to make it seamless so that, you know, again, it's not something that requires so much work and so much individualized support and attention. Again, we want to make sure that students have quick access to that. And then finally, we need to consider function. So for those of you who are aware of the functions of behavior, and if not, we'll be going into it briefly throughout this presentation, but we want to start off by asking ourselves, what is the motivation or what is the function behind the behavior? So today we're going to be just talking about, you know, starting a basic check-in, check-out. That CICO stands in for what's called check-in, check-out, so that we can make sure that the check-in, check-out systems and practices that we're doing matches the function of the behavior that we are trying to address. So for example, escape motivated might also indicate the need for academic interventions. So again, we want to make sure that the intervention is targeted to whatever the need is. All right, and then again, going back to the need for a framework, the triangle or the MTSS triangle that we see is not a program. It's not something that you buy and tells you what to do. It's a framework to guide how you organize your supports for students. On the left, you can see a bike that has all these individual parts, right? So kind of like in the school community, we have so many things happening with practices, initiatives, people with different roles. But if people are doing things in silos, then it's not effective, right? So we know that things can't stand alone to be effective. On the right side, this is what we want to aim for. That MTSS is really a framework that puts these pieces together in place, that organizes the supports that we provide students. But there are essential components to making sure that these things work mechanically. So for example, we need to have a school team, school leadership, data-based problem solving, coaching, effective interventions, and then the implementation is what we're doing to actually carry this out. And then we will be referencing what's this called the school-wide PBIS tiered fidelity inventory. For those of you who have taken the Tier 1 training, we referred to this, but only looked at the Tier 1 section. And now we can start to look at that Tier 2 section, which has 13 features and 3 subscales, and basically looks at what is needed or what systems are needed for Tier 2 to work. So we'll be referencing this, but Check-in, Check-out has its own Fidelity tool that will also be included in the Google folder that specifically has what Check-in, Check-out should look like and has Fidelity measures for that. So again, Tier 2, Check-in, Check-out will have features of a Tier 2 system, but it may not be specified directly in this TFI. So you'll want to go back into the Fidelity tool that we'll be providing in the folder. And again, that's just a visual of how the TFI is broken up. The big buckets are teams, evaluation, and interventions. And then you'll see the items underneath each of those things that really helps you just kind of look at what does a team composition, what should that look like at the Tier 2 level? And it gives you an opportunity to self-assess yourself, or if you work at the district or LEA level and you're using this for a school, you can use this as being an outside evaluator, kind of giving some feedback to your school in terms of fidelity of their MTSS or PBIS. All right, so I'm going to now pass the baton to my colleague, Nakanya.
All right. So, as Jessica said, we are now going to take an opportunity to look at the makeup of our Tier 2 team. So looking at the TFI subscales, we will start with 2.1, which walks us through specifically what should the setup of our team look like for Tier 2. And so if you've joined us for our Tier 1 training, this is something that we did for that training. So now we will go ahead and walk you through the specifics of creating that team composition for our Tier 2 supports. So let's start with what the team would look like. So thinking about what are the roles, who is on the team, what those interventions look like, and then also thinking about what are those necessary conversations for the different components of your systems. When you're thinking about the development of those systems, what should implementation look like, as well as how will we progress monitor our practice. So thinking about that. So this visual here will walk you through those components. I know there are arrows going in different ways, different colors, but you will have the opportunity to go ahead and just utilize this when thinking about how do we flesh out our Tier 2 team specifically. So just some things to note here. When starting with your Tier 1 team, we want to begin to think about those folks who actually plan all of your school-wide, your classroom-wide supports for your staff as well as students. So thinking about that. Here you will see in the box underneath, these are the members who are recommended to be included, and just thinking about the highlights of your mental health team. It's important to have them on your team as well. And really to think about, this is the team, that Tier 1 team, they focus on those universal supports, which would provide supports for the entire building. So thinking about that. And then looking at our Tier 2 systems, this team's role is to go ahead and just utilize your data to progress monitor the systems and supports. And then once again, thinking, this is the team too that will also address those barriers to the systems that you all have created and decided upon for the Tier 2 supports. The next team would be your functions-based team. And this team's responsibility is to create those individualized plans. So thinking about those students who may be identified and needing those intensified supports, this would be the team to take on that particular role. And then also, I just think about it when I was school-based, I think about all of those members who are included when you're creating a FBA or a BIP for students, but these would be the members of that particular team. And then just some other things that are important to note here, highlighted in the integrated teams, just ensuring that there is always family voice. You have your community members as well as your mental health providers. So thinking about really having those folks in the building who are necessary to providing those wraparound supports for your students and your building. So looking at this visual, this allows us to begin to think about the importance of aligning all of our current teaming structures and initiatives. We often talk about people who are school-based who have initiative fatigue. There are all of these different pieces, and it's difficult to ensure we are implementing appropriately if we have not aligned every piece that we have happening within our building. So this chart allows us to be able to create a roadmap for that alignment by looking at who is necessary on the committee, what is the initiative that we are actually planning for, what's the purpose, the goals of this particular team, and then thinking about what's our outcome and the data that we want to utilize and we want to make sure that we focus on. What group are we targeting for support? What staff is specifically involved? And then what are any possible overlaps, any tweaking, or any elimination that needs to be done when thinking about alignment. So this visual is something that's excellent for you all to utilize as you begin planning your teaming structure around Tier 2 supports. So here we see what roles are necessary when we're thinking about planning our teaming components in this particular space. So we just want you to keep this in mind. So these are all of the roles, the potential roles that will be needed when planning for your tier 2 supports. So this is something as you're planning and you're looking at aligning those initiatives. This is just a visual to be able to support there. Here we dive a little deeper into responsibilities that each role plays on the team. So looking here, you have an intervention coordinator. Here we are very specific about what are some of the roles, thinking about even the hours of the week that this responsibility would entail. It's also important here to recognize that you may have more than one person playing more than one role, but I also think it's important to ensure that this is spread out amongst staff members, that there's equitable experience in having these roles so that folks are able to really carry out their duties with fidelity, so folks don't feel like they're overburdened with responsibilities. And once again, this is why it's important to also utilize the other form to align your initiative. So we know, if we have a school climate initiative, we have an SEL initiative, we have RTI, sometimes folks may have 3 or 4 roles. So just thinking about how are we aligning, and this allows you to be able to support with aligning in determining what are the roles and responsibilities that will be necessary as well. So here just looks at what could organization look like of your coordinators for the different practices and interventions here. So this would be a good graphic to sit down with as you are planning and going through the roles, the responsibilities. We have that sheet. We know the time commitment, approximately a week. So this would give you the opportunity to sit down with this to begin to plan and to structure out specifically who are those names that we may want to fill in these boxes with, so we know who's going to be responsible for what and who would specifically be included in our tier 2 team. All right, so looking at our subscale, looking at 2.2, this walks us through what our team operating procedures would specifically look like. So what are those components that we need to focus on? So we've determined who the team is, what the responsibilities, those roles are. So what are those next pieces that we need to focus on and to really flesh out in order to ensure that we are implementing our tier 2 practices as we should be. So one thing that's important to think about is what will your meeting schedule look like? We don't want to leave these types of things to kind of happenstance or just planning, kind of fly by the day to just figure out, well, we'll meet next week, we'll meet the following week. Here, this schedule allows you to be able to specifically sit down and determine, once again, once you've determined who those team members are, what's the day and time that you will meet, where you will meet, how will you meet, will it be in person, will it be virtual? And then having an actual schedule so that this actually is something that is really scheduled, planned out. There are proactive supports in thinking about the planning necessary. It also takes a lot of the guesswork out, the ambiguity. So also it allows staff members who have roles and responsibilities to be able to plan around this calendar meeting as well. It also allows you to determine, well, do we need another meeting? Can we condense meetings? So just thinking about all of those pieces so that you are well planned and organized when it comes to setting up your meeting schedules. So the next thing that we want to think about is, what will we meet about? Do we just come together and decide that day what we're meeting about? So it would be important to have an agenda. So to actually sit down and document what is it that we're going to do during these meetings. So here is just a list of some of those possible agenda items, just to ensure that there's a flow to the meeting and that you're maximizing on time. So this is just another example when you're sitting down to plan. These are some of the pieces that could be included in your agenda items. And just as we started this meeting, Jessica drew attention to our meeting norms and agreements. It would be wise to have your own agreements and norms set up, just so that we all, just like we do with our students, setting up those norms, setting up those agreements so that everyone knows what is expected of them and what are those things that we've agreed upon to ensure that these meetings run smoothly and we actually are having these meetings as we should. So these are just some examples. And then as you're action planning as a team, here are some things just for you all to think about. So just once again, thinking about the teaming structure, who will be on the team, what's the responsibilities, what are those roles, solidifying that team, and then ensuring that all team members are aware that they are a member of the team. Identifying when the meetings are going to happen, setting up a schedule, making sure that folks know when the meetings are taking place. And then figuring out, and one of the things that we talk about in Tier 1 is the use of TIPS, which is Teams Initiated Problem Solving. And it walks you through actually how to plan and set up your meeting. So this is something that can also be utilized. This is on the pbis.org website as well. And we talk about this in our Tier 1 training, but once again, revisiting the TIPS form for use in setting up your meetings. Defining your norms, just determining what your expectations will be so everyone is aware of what is expected of them. And then once again, walking through and planning your meetings, utilizing that TIPS process. As I said, you can go to pbis.org to take a look at some examples there. And then once again, just assigning the roles for your specific meetings that will be taking place. All right, so I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Christian. And Christian, go ahead and take it away.
All right. And so we're going to start talking about screening and decision rules. All right. So in thinking about screening, we want to make sure that we have a written policy that collects data from multiple sources to decide who needs extra support. We have to ensure that our families are promptly notified when students receive these Tier 2 supports. I went ahead and bolded some of the words on the screen that are often missing when I and we think about screening students for more support. We need to make sure it's written down so everyone knows about it. It's not just willy-nilly random like Nakanya was mentioning. Oh, let's just have a meeting tomorrow. No, we need to have a written policy. We need to make sure that we're using different types of data. So we're not just always looking at academics. We're not just always looking at behavior. We're looking at a whole child approach that includes different data points we're going to talk about in a second. And we need to make sure that families are involved and that it is prompt so that way we can actually be effective in catching students and providing the services that they need as we go through. Think about how you can take those steps to make sure that your screening process includes all of these processes. So the first thing we want to think about is the multiple data sources. So we just don't want to look at our academic data and we want to make sure that we're creating that whole child picture, because if we're missing some pieces of data about a student, we could be missing the function or the root of why they are actually struggling. So it could be an academic issue could be showing up in our data, but really we know it's a behavior issue because the student wants to escape, right? In order to create an intervention that actually solves and addresses the real issue, we have to make sure to consider these different data points. So some examples would be looking at things we typically look at, those discipline referrals, the in-school analysis mention, but then also looking at those more subjective times that maybe we don't keep track of data on, those visits to the nurse, the counselors, going to meet with a special adult that they have in the building, maybe a secretary or an administrator that they have that relationship with. We also want to think about not just GPA, but also maybe incomplete work, and thinking about that as something, a data point that could be interesting. And we also want to think about how we can use family, teacher, and student referrals to ensure we're catching all students and looking at that big picture. And so we also know that some students may need extra support without us waiting to collect lots and lots of data. For example, students who are new to your school, students who have multiple teacher managed behaviors, but may not have those documented office visits, or children who struggle with peers, students you might notice sitting alone at lunch, right? We don't need to collect months of data on these students to know that they might need extra support. And maybe the formal data system would catch these students, but also maybe not. So we need to make sure that we are flexible enough in our thinking to allow those predictable patterns to proactively plan for them, right? And to make sure that we are thinking about the data, but also thinking about the children that are represented by our data. So that way we can plan and be proactive to serve those students and get them those services that they might need before the gaps become so large. When we're thinking about decision rules, we need to think about our context and our current levels of data. And so when we think decision rules are just the rules that we would use to guide whether or not students need further intervention, whether or not we as the adults are going to layer on those interventions. And so when we think about that, we want to make sure that there are ways that teachers, families, and students can refer each other for these extra supports. And we know that these rules cannot be the same across schools because different schools have different contexts, and we should always allow for that flexibility because we know that what might be a low risk behavior in one school might be considered a higher risk behavior in another school, and that your tier 1 supports are going to look different depending on your needs of your community. And so we have to make sure that these are written down, that people know these rules and that we use them. But we also have to make sure that we embed that flexibility that we know comes with being human and comes with being in this role that is so community driven. So here is an example of data that a team could use to make decisions on who would receive access to tier 2 supports. And so this is only a sample of what one school used to identify their rules for all 3 tiers when looking at who would be serviced in a tier 1, the proficient score, who might need tier 2 supports, that at risk, and who would be high risk, might need more support, more individualized conversations. And so I would like you with your team or on your own to take a look at this data and spend a moment thinking about how you could change these rules to meet your context and your school. So you see on the left-hand side the different measures of the data that the team uses. So using referrals, using absences, adding in those remote learning pieces that would be helpful, adding in the work completion, having those nurse data included because we know that students who have a pattern of going to the nurse for a stomach ache could be showing other needs and could need other types of support. We also see typical things here like course grades. And then we have these clear rules that would help us identify which students we would need to be supporting, which students would we need to be taking a closer look at and deciding, hey, could they use extra support in the form of a tier 2 intervention? So it could be a student with 5 or more referrals. It could be a student with 4 or more tardies. It could be a student with a DRF in any course. And so taking this data together really helps create a snapshot of who would need these extra supports and how can we get that to them quickly. Another thing that you can think about as your team would be thinking about a universal screener to help decide who would need extra support. But you have to remember that if you screen, you must intervene. So we just don't want to collect a ton of data and have it sit unused, unanalyzed, and unacted upon, right? We want to think through clearly, what are these processes and procedures for using this universal screener? What do we want to learn from this universal screener? And how can we combine that with informal and formal data to actually create an action plan with the picture it is creating? So definitely something to consider at your school level, at the LEA level, but making sure that we have a clear plan in place that if we're going to do this and spend the time and effort and money that it takes to put in on the front, that we are actually going to do something different with the data that we see and what we learn. So when we're looking at the screening and collecting data, we also want to think about how we can have a request for assistance. And in order for that to roll out, we want to make sure that there is a system for a request for assistance, that the team identifies a process for family, staff, and students, that the process includes the team, right? We want to make sure that the Tier 2 team is included and knows about this request system, and that we know that our team can respond within 3 days. Again, we don't want to create a data collection system that we just sit there, right? If students are going to ask for help, if parents are going to ask for help, we need to make sure we respond to that as a request. So we can also, this very much helps us in terms of uncovering the student need, right? It helps us look at a bigger picture of whether staff, parents, and counselors are noticing something. We also want to make sure that students are allowed to request assistance either for themselves or for a friend, because we know that peer support can be really helpful. And it would be a good idea to maybe start with a small sample of students who have access to this referral system and see how it works for your team. So maybe not rolling out this request for assistance plan to all grade levels, maybe starting with a certain grade level or certain group. So that way, you know, your team can handle the amount of volume that is coming through, and you work out the kinks before you create a full implementation plan for this request for assistance. And here is a sample one that you could use. Basically, it's saying, you know, the student name, the grade, who the person referring is, and then what concern you might have about the student. And this really makes it easy for students to be able to access extra support in that Tier 2, layer on that Tier 2 level. Your concerns are found out very quickly, right? So that way you can nip any kinds of conflict that might be happening or any of those gaps in the bud before they become bigger problems down the road. And you need to make sure that your staff is trained on how to use this and what it will be used for, because we want to make sure that it is very clear that this is to layer on support, not to take students out of the classroom, not to remove them from your care, but really to get them the support that they need to be successful. And so as you think about implementing Tier 2 supports as a team, you want to think about the decision rules that you're going to be using, the screeners, the requests for assistance, and how you're going to communicate all of these So now I'm going to pass it over to Jessica, who's going to talk a little bit more about check-in, check-out as a Tier 2 intervention.
Great, thanks, Christian. So yes, we are going to now get into the installation of check-in, check-outs. So installation meaning how do we make sure that we have the systems in place to make sure that Tier 2, in addition to check-in, check-out, is going to be set up in order to include other Tier 2 interventions. So again, we're using check-in, check-out to install a Tier 2 intervention. In this, you'll see that there are critical features of what needs to be included in check-in, check-out. Making sure that what we do matches to student needs, and that we also need to make sure that there is access to Tier 1. And of course, professional development is also needed. All right, so this graphic kind of really tells you how the systems are set up. So at the top, you'll see that it says general education and special education. And the reason why it's explicitly stated there is that some schools may think that special education is again at Tier 3, or it's a separate system. We shift it so that we know that Tier 1 is accessible to all students. and other subgroup populations such as ELL. So we want to make sure that everyone has access to those universal or tier 1 supports. And that's again for social, emotional behavior, and then also academics. And then you'll see that first yellow part for our tier 2 is where we have our check-in, check-out. I kind of like to think this part as being lime green because it's not so much, it's still at the very beginning stages of tier 2 because it's easy, it's efficient, it shouldn't take too much time, but it's a quick layer on in addition to tier 1. And all it does is that it gives you a little bit more explicit instruction on what those expectations are. It gives students more feedback, structure, and then reinforcing what is expected at that tier 1 core. For some students, well, that layer should reach maybe about 10% once it's up and going. And then we wait, just like academics, we see if students respond positively. And if not, then we may think about modifying the check-in, check-out system to tailor their needs. So again, that first layer of check-in, check-out is a uniform system. And then if needed, we may need to modify the check-in, check-out so that it addresses certain academic needs or certain social needs, social emotional needs. And if students are still not responding, we may need to look at it in a deeper level by just doing a brief, informal, function-based problem-solving process, where we're trying to figure out what is the function of the behavior. Are they trying to escape something, or are they trying to obtain something? And we layer on modified versions of tier 2 interventions there. All right. And then that finally, if we go through the brief informal FBA process and it's still not enough, then we really think about figuring out how do we do a formal FBA problem solving process. And that again, as many of you may know, that a formal FBA does take multiple team members and multiple observation processes where we're putting together different data and observations of behavior in different settings to really figure out how do we create an individualized behavior support plan that is tailored to the student. And then check in, check out, the implementation process may look like this. So again, from the data decision rules, or if a student is recommended for check in, check out, then we see that that whole system is implemented, and we'll go over the details there. But that might look like a morning check-in, and again, just a preview or a pre-correction of these are the expectations for you today, giving that feedback from the teacher or whoever's assigned to that student, and then doing that again throughout different parts of the day. So an afternoon checkout. And then we want to make sure that that data and that feedback is also shared with the parents. And again, it starts again the next day. On the right, you'll see that there is a check-in, check-out coordinator overseeing the whole intervention. And so even though on the left side, you may have 3 or 4 staff members with a caseload of 4 to 5 students, you have a coordinator overlooking the whole intervention. So putting that tier 2 team together, you may meet bi-weekly to assess student progress. So again, we have, based on the data and the points that we're looking at for students, overall, do we need to continue the program for them? Do we need to revise it? Or do we need to exit individual students out of the program? Again, we're waiting to see how students respond to this early intervention. And here's a video that we won't play right now, but there is a video on YouTube, and we'll leave the link there for you to view at your own time. But it kind of just shows you a typical interaction between a check-in, check-out teacher or whoever's assigned to a student and what that quick interaction might look like. So who needs check-in, check-outs? Again, it's this lime green level where we're looking at low-level problem behavior. So again, students who may be referred should only be for minor incidents. And so again, depending on the context of your school environment, you may set the bar at 2 to 5 office referrals. You may notice that the behavior occurs across multiple locations. And examples of minor behaviors may be talking out, or just minor disruption, or maybe lack of work completion. Again, that has to probably be spelled out a little bit more and operationalized, because we know disruption can mean different things. But once your team really operationalizes what those behaviors, those minor behaviors look like, and once that's communicated to the staff, then we can easily know and identify students who would be appropriate for check-in, check-out. What's not appropriate would be serious or violent behaviors, extreme chronic behavior, which might mean 8 to 10 office referrals. Students who may require more individualized support, or who may need a functional assessment or wraparound services. So what check-in, check-out again is that it's an extension of Tier 1, where we're helping about 10% of the school. And it's a reboost of what our Tier 1 messaging is. So whatever we have been teaching at Tier 1 in terms of the behavior expectations or values, we want to remind the student, again, this is what it is, and this is what our expectations are of you. And it's an opportunity to also give, in addition, additional feedback and communication and interaction, positive interaction with that student. The intervention, again, should be quick, about less than a minute, and the intervention should provide positive adult contact. It's not to reprimand or to scold them. It's, again, providing more additional opportunities for positive interaction and feedback. And it becomes a learning opportunity as well. What it's not a Tier 3 intervention. It's not an opportunity for students, for staff to point out that students are being disrespectful, right? We want to make sure that we're putting in a positive way. And we don't like to look at it as another thing that teachers have to do. Because again, the more proactive we can be and the more positive we can be, the benefits are going to outweigh all of this. Okay, and then going back to the TFI again, we know that all Tier 2 interventions include 3 core features, and that's additional instructional time for skill development, additional structure, predictability, and increased opportunity for feedback using a daily progress report. And you'll see DPR, so I just want to make sure that we know that acronym. That may be a new one for you, daily progress reports. Okay, and how is this different than other behavior card interventions? Because I know that teachers like to make their own behavior, check-off lists where, we have individualized behavior cards for students. And that's the difference, is that this is really linked again to that Tier 1 school-wide system of behavior support. And it's the same for that group of students who have this check-in, check-out system, who are part of it. Other programs are more individual classroom interventions where teachers have their own, but this really kind of makes it consistent and cohesive in that everyone has the same behavior DPR, which is their card that we'll be showing you in a little bit. And we also know that check-in, check-out should be implemented in all settings and throughout the school day. So it's not just in an individual teacher in one classroom. It's going to be with different teachers if they're in secondary grade levels, and then throughout different parts of the school day. We want to make sure that all teachers and staff are on the same page and that they're trained. and that they know how to get students referred for this intervention early and to receive support quickly. Again, so that 3-day turnaround process. And again, teams use data for decision making to determine progress. Okay, and then so check in with a facilitator at the beginning of the day. So in person, this would look like an adult positively greets a student upon arrival, and this is again before instruction begins, and they may need to provide materials, especially if that's part of their point system. So if a student doesn't have a pencil or if they need a snack, we give it to them. We give whatever they need so that they start on a positive note. It's not a time to catch them not being prepared, right? It's kind of another prompt. They pick up their daily progress report card, and then they know the routine of providing that card to all different staff members throughout the day. In remote learning, it may look a little different, but still the same process. So a teacher may or staff member may meet with a student before online class starts. So that might mean having them log on 5 minutes earlier than the rest of the class. Again, that's an opportunity to provide any materials or tech support if needed. And that the daily progress report is now electronic. So figuring out a system that is easy for the student and the teacher to be able to provide that feedback electronically. Again, still tied to the school-wide expectations. You may review the previous day, but that's optional. Again, whatever is going to be the most time efficient. And then also it's a time to pre-correct. So if they didn't do well the day before, maybe this is a way to remind them and pre-correct any anticipated challenges that you think that they might have for that day. And again, it's always great to provide reinforcement in terms of acknowledging them and celebrating them, making goals, and then layering on that incentive if they reach their goal. Okay, so that is pretty much the same thing. Again, we encourage you to, also use other staff members to be engaged in this process. So it could be a paraprofessional, it can be a dean or any other behavior support staff if teachers don't have the time. So how can we make use of different staff members and having them, use this way of giving students individualized attention through this process. And then check out at the end of the day, again, is a chance to review points and goals with the student. You can take a summary card to look and see if the student met their goal. Again, layering on that reinforcement if they've met their goal. And then for remote learning, how are we going to use email or some sort of communication system in place for when they need that feedback to be sent to their parents? Okay, so again, this is when partnership with families becomes so important. How can parents be engaged in this process? Maybe they provide the reinforcer at home. Again, maybe sharing with the parents that it doesn't mean to buy them a new phone or give them, monetary things. We really want to focus on more so relationship building or social activities and stray away from any of that tangible stuff. And then figuring out a system for parents to acknowledge that they did get the information and they've acknowledged a summary, and just figuring out ways to partner with them to make sure that we're setting up the student for success. We're not using this as a way to find opportunities to punish or shame students for not meeting their goal. We want to make sure that we're really setting them up for success by encouraging them and giving them positive kudos and acknowledgement when they reach their goal. Okay, so whatever that system is, We just want to make sure that families are on board and that they know what's happening, and that this is a really just an opportunity to give extra support for students. Okay, so the daily progress report should be linked to 3 to 5 school-wide expectations. It should be teacher and student friendly. You can have baseline data so you know where they're starting from. The trick is that this first layer of check-in, check-out is the same for all students. And I know that we had a lot of questions about that, but again, it's supposed to be efficient, easy, so it should be the same for all students. Usually we use a 3-point scale. If we do any more than that, then it becomes more complicated. And depending on the time of day of how classes are broken up or instruction is scheduled, we can have up to 10 check-in times. That sounds like a lot, but again, modify it however it needs, however it fits your school's schedule. So we're going to show you some examples of what that looks like. Here's one sample where it's for older students where you have it broken down by period. And on the left side is where you would write in what your school-wide expectations are. Okay, so again, period 1, you rate how the student behavior was, and initial, and then add up the points. And then you see that there's a information on the bottom has celebrations, goal for today, and what the total for today actually is, and if the goal was reached. Here's another example, really similar, except the expectations are already there. Again, this is the same for all students who are receiving check-in, check-out. And I think we have one more that is, this is probably meant for, yeah, this is meant for younger students where you have it broken down by routines. So instead of period, you have the routines of morning circle, live instruction, independent reading, and so forth. So same concept, but just being age appropriate. Okay, what do you notice about this one? All right, so the other ones we recommend, this one we included as a non-example. And the reason being is that those sad faces or happy faces, right, we don't, again, want to shame students. We don't want to put any value in what their behavior was for the day. Because if they start off the morning with sad faces, right, they're not going to feel successful. And so we try to be neutral in a sense that we're just looking at points and we're not putting any added value or shaming them or making them feel bad. Again, we're trying, how do we frame it in a way that's positive and encouraging? All right. Again, just be careful how you set up your systems for points and feedback. Okay, so again, just some other cautions. Be careful about allowing space for open comments because that prompts adults to maybe write something negative, right? When you're kind of maybe had a rough day, you don't want to put, you don't want to express your frustrations through this comment card. Again, we want to try to get adults to be positive. We also want to refrain from any verbal interaction with the student. Again, that's going to maybe trigger students to just give up and not even try for the rest of the day. And again, same thing, parents and families tend to use these comments with their child in ways not intended. And then we lose the opportunity to reteach. Again, this is just a prompt to, again, remind them of, are they going in the right path? And how do we make sure that we're reteaching the expectations that we want them to see so that they're successful? And then here's finally a summary card of what you can do to just synthesize or summarize what progress a student has met for the day, or having them self-reflect and say, okay, did you meet your goal? And having them really reflect. So this can be done from a teacher's perspective, or the way this is set up is that it's a student reflection. So again, this increases more self-awareness, more accountability, and just more goal setting where they can really reflect and then figure out what they need to do better tomorrow. And again, that gives them that reflection piece there, and then everyone acknowledges that. All right, that was a lot, and that is why we broke it up into 2 parts. So we're going to close now and allow you guys to process. And Christian, why don't you remind us what we learned today?
All right. So today we focused on making sure that at our campuses we have a strong Tier 1 system before we start practicing and layering on other tiers of support. We also talked a lot about the functions and the roles on the Tier 2 team, and also about how that team could use data and set up rules and systems to make sure that the rollout of any interventions that the team uses is effective. And then finally, we started talking about check-in, check-out, which is an evidence-based intervention that can be used at the Tier 2 level to layer on extra support for students. Not tomorrow, whenever you watch part 2, my friends, we are going to talk more deeply about data collection and give samples of what that could look like. We're going to talk about how to know whether you fade, continue, or intensify the supports that you're providing to your students. And then we're going to talk about fidelity data. So how do we know that we are actually doing this correctly? And how do we know that this is actually working? And so we'll talk about all those things in part 2, which you can find where you found part 1. At the end of part 2 tomorrow, if you are interested in receiving credit for watching these, there will be an exit ticket, but you must watch to the end of part 2 in order to access those. On the screen now, you can see our my contact information, our website, all of our upcoming live professional developments if you're interested in seeing us live, and also a way to subscribe to our TAL bulletin, which will tell you all of the trainings, not just for us, but for our entire team. So thank you all for watching today. We will see you in part 2. Bye, everyone.